It's the 10th episode of the Albums Only podcast. My name is Alan Beavers. Alongside me, as always, is Jacob Slater. And today we are going to talk about Siouxsie Sioux and the Banshees, better known as Siouxsie and the Banshees. I have a lot of fun saying that. I feel like I'm a 6-year-old that can't say sushi when I say Siouxsie. I really actually enjoy the band. It's not a band that I had known a lot about. I mean, I was familiar with them on the fringes, Jacob. This is a really interesting band, one that I really enjoy, having spent more time with them. What I'm really interested in, though, here is the album that we're going to talk about. And I find this album to actually be a great stop on what we've deemed the rehabilitation tour. And I'm talking about 1987's Through the Looking Glass. This is a covers album in the spirit of David Bowie's Pinups. Very interesting. I think it's completely underrated. It needs to be a part of the rehabilitation tour because it is so sort of dismissed in the zeitgeist of Siouxsie and the Banshees. Jacob, your thoughts?
Siouxsie and the Banshees is one of those bands that I'm familiar with, that I was familiar with when I was starting to get into music. But for whatever reason, there wasn't really a kind of, when I was in U92, college radio, and you're kind of exposed to a lot of different groups, at that time. I think there's like certain kind of demographics, I would say. And I think when I was just starting into college radio and alternative music, there was a certain demographic that kind of dominated the station. Kind of certain bands were very popular and certain bands you didn't really hear that much about. One of the big bands, and you didn't really see that many kind of older bands have this kind of thing. It's usually a more modern band thing. But you'd always hear a lot about the Smiths back then. Like the Smiths were a really big band. Occasionally you'd hear something from REM, but there were certain bands that you just were there in the station. They had a presence, and I'm sure people before me listened to them and played them, but they were just, when I was there, they weren't played. I was the only one I knew who played Dinosaur Jr.
That's interesting to me, though, because you do find that there are perennial bands that sort of get forgotten about depending on who's around, or especially even in college rock.
Yeah, I mean, it was just like when I was around, the big thing was modern indie rock. It was kind of the garage rock revival music. Ty Segall was very big. You heard a lot about, the Growlers and Black Lips and all these kind of...
The A-La-Las.
Yeah, that was one that I remember our music director talking at length about. Yeah, he just didn't hear a lot about kind of certain other bands, and certainly older bands. And Siouxsie was one of those groups that I myself had learned about during my own kind of searches through alternative music, but it wasn't one that I really explored too often because there wasn't really anyone who kind of shared that interest. And I think that's a very important thing about getting into music is the sense of camaraderie and community that can come with music. Because it's either you're like me in high school and you have like these several bands that are your bands, and you kind of model yourself off of that kind of distinction, or you're kind of getting into bigger groups because, you have, people to talk to about those groups. So Siouxsie and the Banshees were definitely one of those bands that I was aware of but didn't explore. The one avenue I do know them from, actually, was that their song Hong Kong Garden was featured in the soundtrack to the video game Sleeping Dogs, which I'm a big fan of that game. It's a very interesting song. It really fits in well with kind of I'm not sure how to describe the Hong Kong of that game. It's very modernistic, but at the same time it's very kind of run down almost. Like it's very kind of built, like handmade.
Slater, do you remember the first time that you heard, and this is one of our perennial questions, the first time that you heard Siouxsie and the Banshees?
I'm not entirely sure. It might have been during my first year of doing radio. I think I might have discovered them through, I want to say probably the first song I ever played by them was probably one of their covers of the Beatles, either Dear Prudence or Helter Skelter.
Oh, interesting. Neither of which are on this album, by the way.
Yeah, they're definitely kind of older tracks because, I was coming from the avenue of, I grew up on classic rock music. Like that was kind of where I started out from. So that was kind of the bridge into, because that was kind of how I got into Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds as well, was at the time, which was like around 2008, I was probably in my junior year of high school or something. I was very much a classic rock kid. I didn't really listen to many bands beyond that.
Well, I think the interesting thing about Siouxsie and the Banshees, and we should probably go ahead and just go ahead and start the history. I mean, this band started out as a pretty hard punk band in the late 1970s. Fascinating story. Hard for me to believe, but it's true. They originally had Sid Vicious as a drummer. He then left the group, but they put out a slew of albums, and of course Hong Kong Garden was their first top 10 hit in the UK in 1978. They released a bunch of albums, 78, 79, and 1980. They released Kaleidoscope, which was a very well-received album. I don't have a whole lot of history with their stuff here. Jacob, your thoughts on their first couple albums, the sound in particular?
It's very interesting, actually, to kind of hear the band's history because, they, as a band, they really kind of got their start as, almost you could say, like groupies, as fans. They had kind of exited the glam rock scene as that kind of ended in the mid-70s. And, looking for a new outlet, Siouxsie Sioux and Steve Severin, who were the original members of the band, kind of joined up with their friends and kind of followed the Sex Pistols around to the point where they were actually well known for kind of their presence at Sex Pistol shows. I believe they were labeled the Bromley contingent by a journalist, which referenced the fact that they were from Bromley, which is part of, I think it's in Croydon in London. Seeing that they got their start through the Sex Pistols, you can kind of see where their first albums kind of get their ideas. Because at the time, there was a definite market for loudness and energy and anarchy in punk music. You kind of saw it in LA and California in the late 70s as punk metamorphosized into hardcore punk. And it was the same in kind of other areas of the globe where punk music went through this stage where they kind of incorporated kind of more and more different and disparate music styles, including experimental styles, like noise manipulation and ambient music, the electronic music of Kraftwerk, which comes into play in this album. And I think it was just like a exploration of that theme, that as kind of punk music evolved into post-punk, you saw either like a hardening of that sound, or you kind of saw greater and greater forms of experimentation until it evolved into something else, whether that was hardcore punk or new wave or goth rock, which Siouxsie and the Banshees is kind of considered one of the pioneers of that group, taking the energy and kind of discordancy of punk music and melding it with synthesizers and electronic music to kind of create this ghoulish kind of cathedral-esque sound. And I speak not from any experiences. Really, Through the Looking Glass is like the first Siouxsie and the Banshees albums that I've actually gotten to sit down and listen to. So I base my opinion on this album really on its own merits and not on its prior work.
Right. Well, I think, the other thing, I really enjoy 1986's Tinderbox. I think that's a great album. It's a really good listen. I'm kind of fascinated with this album, and I nominated this for us to talk about because I wanted to do a Siouxsie and the Banshees album, but I struggled on which one to go over because that's sort of, depending on which part of their career you want to focus on, you've got lots of different ones you can talk about. You can talk about Kaleidoscope. You can talk about Tinderbox. You can talk about Peep Show. You can talk about Superstition. There are various ones you can talk about. But this one fascinates me because there aren't many bands at all that do covers albums. I find this to be a really interesting cover album, and then it goes to show something you mentioned earlier, which is this idea of Siouxsie and the Banshees as sort of a lover of music themselves, and a lover of alternative music, a lover of obscure sort of hits of yesteryear, or deep cuts from alternative bands. And so that's why I think that Through the Looking Glass is a particularly interesting album. I'll go ahead and get started. I think we should get started talking about it. I find the first cut, and for anyone who's listened to the last podcast, will find it very interesting. The first cut here is This Town Ain't Big Enough for the Both of Us. And this is, of course, a Sparks song that we talked about on the last podcast. This one interests me because I actually think this might be the weakest track here, only because it actually probably isn't as good as the original. It misses sort of the eclectic nature of the original. It's very propulsive. It's a great rock song, but they sort of do a great rock reproduction of it. However, I kind of find this is the weakest track here simply because it sounds of lesser quality than Sparks. That sort of frantic energy is missing.
The original song, This Town Ain't Big Enough for Both of Us, the opening track off of the 1974 album Kimono My House. Back when we did that episode, we mentioned that Sparks was incredibly popular in the UK and not in their home country, the US. So you can kind of see where the inspiration came from. Obviously, Sparks was big in the glam scene of the mid-70s, and a lot of kind of the punk and art rock acts of the late 70s kind of were birthed from glam. It's really hard to match kind of the energy and the kind of grandness that is kind of condensed into like 3 minutes that you see with Sparks. This song is actually, I found it very interesting because I had listened to the original songs so often that you kind of get it locked into your mind what the song should sound like. And so kind of seeing what people do differently with it can often be a treat. And the one thing I noticed on this song was obviously they tried to match the same energy as the original song musically, which they get close to, but it's not quite the same in that way. Vocally, I think Siouxsie Sioux actually does something pretty interesting, because if you've heard the original song, you know that Russell Mael, the vocalist of the band, when he's hitting the chorus of the song, there's a definite kind of staircase up to the eventual high note of that song. So, and it ain't me who's gonna leave. You're building up to that note. Siouxsie actually does the complete opposite. She's kind of where Russell trends up. Yeah, she's trending down, which is kind of very interesting to me because obviously not many people are going to be hitting the same high notes as Russell Mael is. And so kind of doing the opposite might be considered, the easy route. But I find it actually kind of interesting in a way. The way it's done kind of sounds really off, and yet I really enjoy it for whatever reason. And also I noticed that you can kind of hear a little bit of it in this first track. There is like I want to say like an Indian influence. There's something about like the strings, like near the end of the song, that kind of just bring to mind like this Indian or Hindi folk music.
Well, that's interesting because one of the things that we talked about with Sparks was that, Kimono My House did have sort of a Far East or even Middle Eastern kind of influence or flair to it. So it's interesting here that you would note that. I think that does reflect well on the song. It sort of reflects similarly what Sparks did to it.
Doing a covers album, you obviously can't judge a song without kind of judging it by the original. On this scale, I'd probably give the edge to Sparks on this one. I think the cover is very interesting, but I think this is one of those cases where they don't do enough to kind of change up the game.
I agree. That's actually the perfect way to look at it. I think, yeah, there's all this, like I said, I think when we talked about Sparks, there's all those little touches. There's those little, like, added sound effects that are on the Sparks. The singing is more frantic or manic. It's just out there more. I think it suits the song better. But that's not to say that, the Siouxsie and the Banshees cover isn't bad. I actually think it's good in its own way. It's fine, and it fits on here just fine. The next track, though, this is one that I think is a real testament to their ability to take something and make it their own. So originally we had Kraftwerk's Hall of Mirrors, which is a sort of atmospheric, slow, kind of plodding song. And it's Kraftwerk. That's fine. It works well to set the mood there. What Siouxsie and the Banshees do is they take that and they make it more into a traditional rocker. There's a great bass line here that's sort of repeated. This is, again, one of the words I would use to describe the whole album is sort of generally propulsive. They're taking a lot of mid-tempo or songs that might, I don't know how to say it, that are sort of missing that melodic sense, or the melody isn't accentuated. And they take that and then they sort of push that forward and make it into like a real rock and roll friendly song. And I think Hall of Mirrors is a good example of that. And there's a certain sensuality here that Siouxsie brings to the song when she sings it that doesn't come through in Kraftwerk and the sort of stilted or robotic vocals you sort of get there.
Hall of Mirrors featured in the 1977 album Trans-Europe Express by Kraftwerk, an album that I had actually listened to prior to listening to this album several years ago. The influence of Kraftwerk on kind of electronic music and alternative music is unquestionable. Obviously, they're one of the big krautrock. The song itself is kind of exactly what you imagine Kraftwerk to be. Very stark, very cold music that sounds like it's been built in a factory, kind of composed mechanically. It's a very kind of calming, soothing song, I think, the original is. Siouxsie Sioux's cover of it, it feels like a warmer song. It's more, it takes the mechanical beats of the original song, speeds it up, makes it more of a dancier number. You get the same kind of tones, but it's a lot more energetic, which I really like. And even one of the members of Kraftwerk, I think Ralph Hutter, actually really enjoys how the band kind of transformed the song.
Yeah, that's a great point. I hadn't seen that. I hadn't seen him note that, so that's great to hear. And I think again, it's just it's a nod to, and I think this is, again, we can get into sort of this debate, right? Do you take a song and sort of make it your own, or do you take songs and that sound a certain way and completely kind of change them? And I think Siouxsie and the Banshees do kind of both here on this album, and particularly in this song, they take something and make it totally different, and it ends up being their own. So they kind of do both, and this is a great example of that. I think Hall of Mirrors is a great track. We move on to track number 3. This one is interesting. So this is Trust in Me. You might know Trust in Me from Disney's The Jungle Book. It's also sung by Etta James. This is another track where you're sort of pulled in to a very sort of almost mystical world here. This feels very gypsy-esque when you've got Siouxsie Sioux singing it. It's a fine track. It sort of works well. Her voice lends itself well here. I kind of like how she rolls her R's here. She's sort of playful in her own way. What was your opinion on it? Because if I recall, you weren't quite as kind. I could be wrong here, but what were your thoughts towards the track?
Yeah, there's just something about this song. Like I'm impressed that they made such a pull. You have prior to this, you had like Sparks, which was a big band in the UK. You have Kraftwerk, which was an enormously popular band. And then you have this song from relatively low-key Disney movie. It definitely seems like a weird place to pull a song from. And I appreciate it in that sense. The song Trust in Me, performed by Sterling Holloway as Ka the Snake. Sterling Holloway you might know from... He did a lot of voices for Disney movies back in the day. He was the voice of the Cheshire Cat in Disney's Alice in Wonderland. He was very famous as the voice of Winnie the Pooh. And the original song, which is sung by Ka as he is kind of trying to hypnotize Mowgli, kind of the build-up to him eating Mowgli. It's a very serpentine song. It's very kind of slinky, jazzy. You definitely get a sense that you're dealing with a creature skilled at the art of seduction in that way. And the music in the original song is very slight. You get that kind of classic snake charmer horn. And the cover expands the sound several degrees. You get like some bongos going on, I think, some different drums, the whole strings and everything.
Harp comes in nicely there too.
Yeah, and I mean, definitely, they're trying to like make a fuller song. I don't really know if it's necessary. There's certainly some songs where I think the band kind of overplays their hand in that regard. And I think sometimes it works, and sometimes in Trust in Me, it doesn't work. And you mentioned like the way that Siouxsie rolls her R's. To me, it ends up coming across as a bit goofy. Like the thing that comes to mind is like Eartha Kitt in the old Batman show where she's playing Catwoman. There are times when she does come across as very kind of seductive, like the song would have her imply, and then there's other times where it just kind of descends into kind of parody.
Yeah, and that's fair. I mean, I understand that. I don't disagree. I kind of find it charming in its own way, but again, I could understand that point of view. We move on from that one, and we go to, I think, another one of the better tracks here, possibly one of the very best on the album, This Wheel's on Fire, which is a cover of Bob Dylan. What I really like here, I mean, this is, by the way, the longest song on the album, 5 minutes and 17 seconds. They take a song that's sort of, forgive me for criticizing the immortal Bob Dylan, but kind of is languid and really doesn't really work well for me. I hate to criticize someone of such, well, renowned, but the fact of the matter is the original of this song just doesn't do it for me. I don't care for it. I listened to this cover, and it's a rock and roll kind of like focused, sharpened, honed attack that really does a great job being, again, I keep using the word propulsive, but that's the one word I would use here. And they do a great job with the guitars. They have these sharp, high-pitched guitars that sort of run through it. And Siouxsie sounds like she knows exactly what she's doing, and she delivers this very melodic, very nice chorus-driven song. I think this is sort of one where they take a song, they sharpen its claws, and they make it fit perfectly on this album. And they take something and make it their own. And again, they make it better, in my opinion, too, which is unbelievable.
Forgive us for throwing mad shade on Nobel laureate Bob Dylan. But yeah, This Wheel's on Fire, first appearing, I believe, on the Basement Tapes, which was the name for a bootleg series of recordings made with Bob Dylan and the band.
How many Basement Tapes are there, by the way? This we could get into another discussion about this. Someone should do a podcast just about how many different Basement Tapes there are of Bob Dylan. I think they're up to like 16 or 17. I'm not kidding. And they're long. Each one's like 30 songs or something absurd.
Yeah, tune in next week for our new podcast.
It's just us throwing mad shade on Bob Dylan.
Yeah. Like,
That'll
I
go for
know you
real
were
well.
very influential on me, but fuck you, Bob Dylan. Zimmerman, I should say. The thing about the Basement Tapes is that their mystique, the legend that came up around the recordings, like, oh, this secret bunch of songs made by Bob Dylan and the band, like, it's got to be great stuff. Thing is, Basement Tapes aren't all that great in a lot of ways. Like, there's some great songs on there, but it's Bob Dylan and the band screwing around in their garage, basically. So this Feels on Fire, the original song, it's just kind of a simple country rock song, really. It's nice in the sense that you have great musicians performing it, but it's not really anything spectacular, I would say. The cover is basically a completely different song. That song was very much of its time in the late 60s. This song is very much of the 80s. Just big, sweeping, strings and synthesizers kind of pounding out a beat. If the original song was like playing at like a 5, they've transformed it into a 10. And just in terms of scope. There's definitely some times when you can tell that it's a cover. Like, I don't think anyone in the 1980s, especially anyone from England, was saying, notify my next of kin. That's like kind of the one sign that you're dealing with an older song.
Sailor's Knots, I think, are mentioned as well. That's probably another one.
Like, no one from Croydon is talking about Sailor's Knots. It's a really kind of grand, sweeping song and very kind of energetic, really kind of get your toes tapping and everything. And it's a really good song, actually. It's one of those cases, I think, where a band takes a song from a previous band and reworks it completely and like does something new with it, reinvents it, which I prefer over just in the case of the first track here, where there isn't really there's not enough done in terms of changes. Like, this is like almost a complete reinvention. Appreciate, but it's also a case where not only is it a reinvention, it's honestly a better song than the original.
Yeah, my feelings are shared exactly on that. Any other thoughts before we move on?
Just that Bob Dylan ain't nothing. Come at me, 80-year-old man.
Oh, man. You know what's sad? I really like Bob Dylan's newest one, where he takes on the standards collection. He does some standards, some Frank Sinatra and whatnot. I actually like it quite a bit because Dylan's voice is shot, and that's what he solely relies on for the album. And it's really good. I mean, I liked it. I enjoyed it. But anyway, it's very relaxing, I must say. After totally dismantling Bob Dylan, we move on to the last song on the A-side of the album. It's a fitting song for the closer on the A-side. It's Strange Fruit, which is a Billie Holiday cover of a classic song about racism in the South. This is really good. I like this one. I think this is a solid cover. Again, I don't know if they do too much to make it their own, but Siouxsie singing it really works here, and it closes out the A-side nicely.
The original by Billie Holiday is kind of, at least the version I heard. There are probably several different recordings of it. But the version I heard was kind of, just a really simple vocal jazz track. I think the kind of thing that was really interesting about the original song is kind of the graphic imagery of that song. For like the 1930s to hear like songs about bodies like hanging off of trees and everything, it's a very brutal and violent song. Prescient, I think, at that time when there was still, I guess, racial tension has never left, but
it's very interesting to me. This is the original song. I mean, the original song came out in 1939. You're talking about overtly political and social commentary. I mean, arguably, that's some of the very first out there, particularly in what we could consider mainstream music today. It's sort of the first incantation of that. That's fascinating to me. The strings here make this something else. They are pretty over the top and they're pretty good. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to get that out there though. This is the song at its time was prescient about what the future of rock music would have to say about politics and society.
Like, when you consider that even like Sammy Davis Jr., who was one of the biggest singers of his time, worked with Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, even someone as big a star as him, because of the color of his skin, still had to like take the back entrance to like perform at his own concerts. So it was a no holds barred attack, I think, that I don't think that people really tried to explore all that often. The music of that era, I might be mistaken, but the cover is very interesting to me because at the beginning, I am reminded once again of Scott Walker, who I mentioned as having an influence on the opening track to David Bowie's Black Star. This use of strings is so overpowering in the opening parts of this song. It's to the point that it almost feels melodramatic. Like the strings are so omnipresent and so overwrought that it almost threatening to drown under the strings. Near the end of the song, suddenly it lurches into this drunken Dixieland jazz, which reminded me a lot of something from Tom Waits, especially in his Swordfish Trombones period. Too, like, kind of strange. It's to the point where you think it wouldn't work just because it's, like, so kind of on the nose and so present. You can't really escape from it, I think, that it actually ends up working. The strings are so loud that you would think, oh, this is kind of annoying. But I'm trying to focus on the song.
Well, they're oppressive. Brings on the feeling of the lyrics. I mean, it really goes to accentuate the feeling of sort of the oppression, that one might feel being black in the South. That sort of laid bare there.
It seems melodramatic, but at the same time, it really kind of heightens the emotion.
We move on from there to another track that you're a big fan of the Doors. You mentioned the Doors earlier. We move on to You're Lost, Little Girl, which is a Doors cover. I hadn't heard the original Doors cover. I'm not as big a fan of the Doors as you are. I like the Doors. I kind of find them a bit one note for my liking. I find this cover to be fine. They really don't do too much to make it their own. I think things are a little more, again, sort of all the instruments come through probably a little more clear than the Doors ever did. This is fine. I think it's more of a homage to a band that they really admire than something that they really make their own or do too much with.
For me personally, like, the Doors was a group that was like alternative before I knew what alternative was. Kind of very kind of dark and mysterious. You had Jim Morrison like speaking about philosophical subjects and kind of the very poetic terms. So I can see where the influence on later punk musicians and such would have on them. This song, Your Lost Little Girl, shows up on their second album, Strange People, or Strange Days, I think, released in, I think, 1968.
That's
correct. Or not, no, 67.
That's right.
It was released like several months after their debut album.
Yeah, they put out a lot right in a row. And what I love about that is any detractor will say, well, you were looking at the internet. But I know by the way that you talk that was very good recall memory. So,
and it's just, interestingly enough, it's that kind of shotgun kind of recording has very much to do with Through the Looking Glass. This album was released, I think, a year after their last album, which was Tinderbox. And the entire idea behind the recording session was, spontaneity. We really want to get in the studio, put something out, much in the mind of kind of the classical style of recording in that way. But strangely enough, though I'm a huge fan of the Doors, Strange Days was one of those albums I hadn't really listened to all that often. I was usually more of a debut album and L.A. Woman listener, and also a little bit of a Morrison Hotel. Really fan of Peace Frog. Conclusion I kind of reached with the original song as I was listening to it was that at certain points it is a very kind of modern for the 80s kind of track. The way that it opens with the solo bass line, might be a little bit of drums in there, and Morrison's voice really kind of brings to mind to me post-punk music that was going on in the early 80s very much. Up until Ray Manzarek comes in with the organ, I think it is very much kind of a post-punk song in that way. The cover captures that sound, but the problem is, at least to me, is that the Doors are such a 60s group to me. They might just be the 60s, that trying to capture the sound of a Doors song just doesn't sound right. Like, I don't know what it is, but the way that the songs are constructed, it never really sounds right to me when people try to redo it. They add a little bit of like strings and such to this song, which I like a little bit. It kind of like builds it up a little bit more. But this is another one of those songs that I don't think does enough to kind of change things up and try to reinvent it, so that I wouldn't have that issue of that you can't really reinvent a Doors song.
We move on from there to a song that, I mean, you want to talk about adding one key element to a song that sort of changed. We look at historiographically, it sort of changes the perception of the song or how the song is sort of covered in the future. We move on to Iggy Pop's The Passenger, which is the next track here. What Siouxsie and the Banshees do here is they take that song and they add horns, which becomes the way that the song, and for many people, becomes remembered. The sort of the horns that punctuate the song, you also get sort of the lyrics become a little more accentuated here. Iggy Pop kind of sings a little one note, right? Like he's it's a little stale there. That's sort of his delivery. That's his vocal style. That's fine. It gets a bit of a lift here. And I think this sort of brings the song into the 1980s, and it adds an element which is sort of never forgotten in subsequent reinterpretations of the song.
The original song, The Passenger, released off of Iggy Pop's 1977, I believe it's 77, might be 79, album Lust for Life, was released in the same year as his other big solo album, The Idiot, which featured a song written by David Bowie, just to kind of add another thumbtack to the ever-growing web.
Bring it all back.
Yeah, of constantly referencing our own material. I mean, the original song is kind of one of those songs that really represents the artist. And The Passenger is like this, it's a really kind of simple song, and yet there's this energy to it that Iggy Pop works into his kind of natural charisma and swagger into it, just to kind of create this atmosphere of wildness and craziness that was kind of always associated with him in his solo days and with his days in the Stooges. It's a song that, it's one of those songs that I think if life were a movie, it's the song, one of those songs that would play when you're like really drunk and at a party. Like it's one of those songs that you would want in your head as you're like careening through a plate glass window or something.
Right. No, I can understand that. That's a great point. Particularly if you're feeling disconnected. I can almost see some Zach Braff directed film using that as sort of an homage to feeling out of step and disconnected at a Wild Rager or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a song that kind of confers like a sense of immortality, which really kind of fits in with Iggy Pop's kind of the mythology that had built up around him, I think, at that time. The cover is, well, I'll just go out and say it's fantastic. The horn section, which is performed by Pete Thomas on trombone, Luke Tunney on trumpet, and Martin Dobson on the saxophone. It really kind of, I'm a big fan of horns in rock music in general, so I'm already on board with that. But
you pushing the ska on me, but I just won't I just won't accept it.
We're gonna do the Real Big Fish eventually.
We will. We really will.
Yeah. Like it adds the horns in this song really adds like a kind of energy. The original song kind of was built on this kind of this repetitive rhythm that kind of put you in like this hazy mindset where you're just kind of letting the music kind of take you. The cover, those horns, it just like blasts you into consciousness. This is a song that you just hear blaring out from like a stadium or something like that. The horn just provides so much like vitality to this.
Yeah, bombast. Something there that sort of breaks a little bit of the monotony, which works well if you're playing the song live or something like that. I think you're right. It sort of brings it to life. You move forward to a song that I have to tell you, I'm a huge fan of this original song and the original album that it appeared on. John Cale, I believe it was 1978. I could be wrong on the year. The album Fear by John Cale, which I would argue is his best album. That's a debatable topic, of course, but love that album. The song Gun is great originally. It's really good. It's John Cale at his best. What I like about this one is sort of the same thing that I liked in reverse about the very first song that we talked about, which is This Town Ain't Big Enough for the Both of Us. On the original version, you don't get a lot of sort of this playfulness. You don't get a lot of these extracurricular sounds that sort of make their way into the song. It's still a great song. It's still got John Cale's signature sound. But here, we sort of get that playfulness. We sort of get, when they're sort of talking about impending death, there's sort of, there's guitars sort of tingling at high pitch. There's sort of this sense of impending doom. There's a lot more, again, playfulness in how this was performed. And especially also in Siouxsie's lyrics, there's also that as well. I think it works better than the original in a lot of ways. I love the original. I think the playfulness here makes it their own at the very least. It may not make it better for some people, but they certainly make it their own.
This was a song that I hadn't heard about before listening to this album. Although I do know the name of John Cale, and obviously Siouxsie The Banshees were aware of John Cale, as the Velvet Underground was one of the most influential bands on alternative music and pop music. And the thing that struck me about the original song, which featured in John Cale's 1974 album Fear,
was it 74? I was way off.
Yeah.
My bad.
Yeah, you're making us look bad, Beeves.
Well, this is the thing, right? We're doing this without looking. This is part of the fun that we have is, do you remember what year that album was? And then we kind of rag on each other if we don't. That's what we do.
Yeah, we're doing it with like our hands tied and our eyes closed too, in case you want to. Yeah, the thing that surprised me about the original song is that it is very much like a by the books kind of rock number. It's very stompy, I think, very kind of taking mind from the glam rock scene at the time. But it's very kind of a standard song, which I think might surprise some people because I think, the albums that John Cale was in the Velvet Underground for, which was the Velvet Underground and Nico and the 1968 follow-up White Light, White Heat, those are generally considered the most kind of experimental, kind of avant-garde albums. So it's kind of interesting that, you hear John Cale doing something that is very much non-avant.
You look at, that's its own ball of wax, which is very fascinating, but Cale's often credited for being avant-garde. You look at his earliest works, his earliest solo works, like Fear, and his first solo album that he put out, Vintage Violence from 1970 is his first solo work. And for all the talk about John Cale being avant-garde and out there and doing his own thing, Vintage Violence, Fear, these albums are very pop, very base. I don't want to say basic as in simplistic, but just very, they have mainstream appeal. And Vintage Violence, for instance, isn't quite able to pull it off. Big White Cloud is beautiful. It's a great song. It's the only real great song on that album. By 1974's Fear, he pulls it all together, and he has this sort of sprawling album that works on almost every level with every song. Cale, for as much of the avant-garde as he gets credited for, is not not really there in some of his better works.
Both John Cale and Lou Reed, who were founding fathers of alternative music, and their work after Velvet Underground could be considered very much non-alternative. You have like things like Metal Machine music, obviously, but you look at something like Coney Island Baby or Transformer. Lou Reed's just doing like pop rock stuff. He's doing what he was doing on Loaded. Really, it's just kind of interesting to think that what avant-garde musicians want to do is like do simple stuff rather than kind of this heavy experimental stuff sometimes. The cover of Gun I'd say the biggest similarity is probably this rock stomp thing. Other than that, there's like very different sounds that are going on in this song. Obviously, you got horns coming in, but you got like this strange guitar filter that's going on. Makes things seem very surreal, bizarre. Kind of reminds me a little bit of like something from Oingo Boingo, actually. This combination of like strange effects, filters and effects, combined with a horn section and everything. As a song, I think it's very interesting. Obviously, it does change things up when compared to the original. Like, it's hard to say that it's that you would go for this song over the original, because the original is like such a simple, kind of universally acceptable song, whereas the cover is kind of this weird departure from that in a lot of ways.
We move on to Sea Breezes, which this is a cover of Roxy music. And this is what I love. In theory, I should love Roxy music, especially early Roxy music, because you have Brian Eno, who is basically thought of as a saint in the alternative rock world, and he should be. You have Brian Ferry, who's done some other stuff. He took Roxy music in lots of different directions post Brian Eno. And Roxy music, beloved glam rock pioneers. I find this cover of Sea Breezes to be interesting. It sort of crescendos. It's got sort of guitars that crash. It's really built on the drums. I kind of find this to be a more, again, you talk about streamlining. That's really what you hear here is this sort of the eccentricities are gone from the song a bit. It's sort of streamlined. Siouxsie delivers the lyrics in her own always entrancing way. It's a fine song. It doesn't do too much different or crazy than the original. I feel like it's just an interesting track built on sort of crescendos and sort of always trying to build up until the crash comes in a way. Much like a sea wave instead of a sea breeze. But I think it does its job just fine.
Sea Breezes, which was featured in their 1972 debut album, self-titled, it's very interesting. It's kind of a song that is split into three pieces, much like what you would hear in the late 60s when pop music was kind of becoming more complicated, kind of taking in more elements of like opera and such like that. Kind of reminds me of something like the Beatles' A Day in the Life, where you kind of have like certain distinct sections of music almost seem disparate from each other. The original, you kind of start off with this kind of almost folky, kind of stark song, which kind of shifts into a pop or a soul kind of thing before switching back into the sea almost, which in the cover is done pretty much in the same way. You have like the quiet, loud, quiet kind of thing. The touches of the original where you can like hear the sounds of the sea rolling in are gone, but there's a much greater bombast and energy when we reach like the bridge. The original was kind of like a Beatles-esque pop soul kind of thing. The cover reminds me more so of like Led Zeppelin, like just this really loud kind of pounding drums. Reminded me of something like you'd hear off of Led Zeppelin 3 or something like that. I think like it's that part that kind of really drives the song home. I think it really kind of sets it maybe not above the original song, but definitely sets it on the same level. The original song may be like the last track on that album, near the end, so you're kind of, if you were listening to the whole thing, you were already kind of winding down the energy a little bit. Here, you're kind of winding down a bit, but Siouxsie and the Banshees still have some life left in it.
You could almost make the argument this should close the album. I don't think that's wrong, because the closer here is a B-side, a deep cut from a band that released arguably one of, if not, you can make the argument, the greatest guitar rock album of all time. And this goes to show sort of the prowess of the work of Siouxsie and the Banshees, that Siouxsie and they decide to cover this. I mean, that's something that just you really wouldn't see too much of. And this was a B-side that appeared with Marquee Moon. So this one is very similar actually to the original. You get a lot of, the same sort of sounds, the same sort of tinkering with the guitar. That's sort of the appeal here. And I think it's an interesting cover. I don't know if it really does too much. I think it probably exposes a certain group to a new sound and to a band that they might not be familiar with. It doesn't do too much to change the formula of Little Johnny Jewel. It is nice, though, to see a band like Siouxsie and the Banshees sort of take it and sort of run with it and make it their own.
I think it's also interesting to note that the songs prior to this were really showing the band's influences. You had like Sparks, you had The Doors. Television, who released their first album in 1977, are really contemporaries of Siouxsie rather than kind of people you look up to. These were kind of in your same circle.
Go back to what you said earlier, right? You said, and we sort of had the same thing reflected in the States. You go back to the punk movement, you talk about the punk movement. Well, in the United States, too, there were these bands that were punk, but punk in their own way, right? I mean, Television were considered punk. They sort of were in that CBGB's movement. Original member of Television was Richard Hell, a big punk pioneer. He's the one who invented, clothespins, ripping your clothes and putting clothespins all in them and over them. To sort of hold them together. So they were a part of that punk scene, much in the way that Siouxsie and the Banshees were. But they sort of took a different direction, much in the way that the Talking Heads did. So this is interesting. We talk about the punk movement and what happened in the United Kingdom and particularly in the East Coast of the United States. They sort of evolved in different directions. So it's interesting to see that parallel as well.
When we talk about punk, the thing is, we use it like a catch-all term, but in fact, you don't really have that kind of definitive thing that you can point to, even at the kind of birthplace of the genre, as like a definitive sound. 1977, I mean, you had the Clash's first album. I believe you had like the Ramones released an album during that time. Might have been like Rocket to Russia or something like that. You had like Television release an album. 1977 was like a year full of amazing albums by bands that would be labeled as punk, but there's not really any specific thing that ties them together in that way. Like musically, lyrically, they're all doing different things. You have Television who do long kind of explorations guitar-wise. You have the Clashes who are doing like really kind of speedy stuff at the time, but who would incorporate reggae into their stuff, were much more political than stuff you would hear in the United States. And you had the Ramones, who were like the ultimate kind of simplistic band. Like all these different groups are labeled as punk, but punk doesn't really mean anything in that context. You still had bands that were adventurous musically, were exploring different avenues musically, even though punk music was considered to be like a back to basics thing, a simplistic form of music, which given kind of how quickly punk music turned into post-punk and then new wave and goth rock and synth pop and all this other stuff, you can kind of see where the label falls apart, much like grunge does when you actually take a look at who was performing it, much as like krautrock. I think there's something to be said about how we view labels in that way.
Well, it's interesting, too. I'm looking now back through sort of the history of television. Little Johnny Jewel was their first single. It was their first song that they actually put out in 1975. It didn't appear on Marquee Moon, except for as a bonus track on certain remastered editions. But Little Johnny Jewel was the first song that they put out. In fact, being put out in 1975, that would have been back when Richard Hell was part of the group, I believe.
Little Johnny Jewel, just to kind of rein it back into the song itself. The thing is that the original song it's a bit like Gun in the sense that it's a very kind of simple song. I think you can really tell the influences of groups like the Velvet Underground in here. In fact, when we were discussing this album prior to recording, I think I mentioned it was pretty much just like, something like Heroin or Sister Ray, where I guess the enjoyment of the song is kind of in the length of the song, kind of like losing yourself in a simple rhythm, which is part of the appeal of Sister Ray, I think, the original Velvet Underground song off of White Light, White Heat. It's a 17-minute long song that only really has like 5 minutes of content, not really any lyrics to speak of, just kind of invoking this almost trance-like state. Little Johnny Jewel kind of captures a little bit of that magic in the original recording, that it's just kind of this song that you kind of just lay back with your headphones on and kind of lose yourself in. The cover song follows that same direction, adds a little bit of flair to it, I think. You have like a little bit of strings and such. And by the way, Martin McCarrick is the person who does all the string arrangements on this album. I think he actually ended up becoming a member of the band officially after this album. He entered, and John Valentine Carruthers, who plays guitar and keyboards, this was actually the last album he was on with the band. So, I mean, it ends up feeling like a bit of a fuller song with all these touches, but it's one of those cases where, again, I don't really think the song warrants all these touches. There's not really anything that is so kind of game-changing in the way that it's done, that kind of totally changes the song on its, turns it on its ear or anything. It's fine. It's a entertaining song.
Now, I think people will hear the fact that, we're saying we're trying to rehab this album, and the fact that, we've made some legitimate complaints about a few songs at least. And they'll say, well, how you've made criticisms about this song and that song and this song, and yet you still want to say you're rehabbing the album. I want to make this clear. I mean, we're talking about an album that is long forgotten. I mean, this is sort of an obscure footnote in many ways. And, you read some articles, you're going to see that people want it to remain that way. I don't think that does Siouxsie and the Banshees justice, because this is sort of a great look at their influences. And there are some great tracks on here. And, I mean, let's face it, cover albums are hard to come by. There's some great tracks on here that they remake, they make their own, and they make better. And I think that because of the fact that it reflects Siouxsie and the Banshees' influences, and because there are some songs here that they just turn on their head and really make wonderful, that this deserves some recognition as one of the great cover albums that exist. So that's why I really wanted to talk about this with you, Jacob, and with the listeners. Is this album is in need of a bit of a rehab. It's not perfect. There's a reason that it's somewhat maligned. I mean, it's the fact that there's not a whole lot here that's new. Obviously, it's all full of covers, but they do a lot with these songs that is new. And I think in the sort of abridged version of covers, this deserves a shinier spotlight because it's good. It's enjoyable. It plays itself out nicely. It covers a wide range. I think there's a lot to be lauded for on this album, and I feel that's why we needed to discuss it.
I mean, I think, and we went on a big tangent about this before recording, about how cover songs and albums of cover songs are kind of treated in kind of the post-singer-songwriter era of modern music. That it sometimes gets considered easy to do covers of songs, that it doesn't really take as much skill to cover other people's material as it is to write your own. Forgetting the fact that up until, we had singer-songwriters, songwriters performing their own material on a regular basis, when before that gained traction, that pretty much all music was cover music. Beethoven wasn't performing every performance of the Ninth Symphony. He wrote it for orchestras to perform. And, folk music is the continuation of cultural heritage through cover songs. You have this song about miners that was written in like the 1860s. If you're performing it in the 1930s, it's a cover song. So there's definitely a case where if you're not expanding upon the song, if you're not kind of changing things with the song, there's definitely a argument to be made that it's the easy way out or it's simplistic to do. But the act of covering is important in music, is that to bring awareness of these musicians and of their work to new audiences, I think is always important. About this album, there are things that it does really well, as we said, and there's songs that they don't do very well. The thing about putting it in the hashtag rehab tour was that given the amount of time that has passed since this album came out and the reviews have come out, if someone is looking for music to listen to, and they're like, oh, I've heard about Siouxsie the Banshees, what album should I kind of check out? They're not going to be going for the albums that are rated 3 stars. They're going to be going for the most highly rated, the most popular stuff, which I think is a disservice. If you don't have any knowledge of that album, people are kind of pushing it to the side. You don't really have the ability to see the album and to understand it, to kind of see the good parts and the good points. So that is why we started with this album on the rehab tour, was to kind of bring attention to, an album that you might not have heard about, they might not have even considered exploring before now because there was such a stigma attached to it. And so hopefully, now that you've kind of heard us ramble on and make disparaging comments about Bob Dylan, that you'll see it in new light. You might actually see other albums in new light that you might not have thought about otherwise.
Well, I think that's a great point to end it at. I want to thank everyone for listening. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at albumsonly. You can email us if you like at albumsonlypodcast@gmail.com. We'll be looking forward to that. My name is Alan Beavers. I've been joined by Jacob Slater. We want to thank you guys for joining us. We're going to continue the rehab tour on our next podcast by talking about the Velvet Underground and the album Squeeze, which is sort of disowned, but maybe it shouldn't be, and Slater and I will talk about that.